let's talk about Ayurvedic perspectives on depression. Before we really explain the Ayurvedic perspective on depression, we have to start by sort of explaining and comparing to the Western perspective on depression. To begin with, we think about depression as an independent disease, right? It's a diagnosis that happens to another person. We have studies on depression. We have treatments for depression, but we don't really have treatments for people. And I know it sounds kind of weird because you think like, doesn't depression require a person? And in a sense, yes, but if you really look at it, the way that we classify it is that disease is an independent entity that has independent treatments. And our treatments are targeted at the disease, not targeted at the people. And you can understand this very simply if you go into a psychiatrist's office and you ask them, what is the treatment for depression? And then they tell you, okay, this pill is a treatment for depression. And then you ask them, the next question is, will this pill work for me? And then the psychiatrist, if they've been trained well, will say, actually, I have no idea. Because what I can tell you is that this pill works for most people who have this constellation of symptoms that we call depression. But I don't know if it works for you. So the Western perspective on depression is really one that isolates a disease from a person. And even if you look at sort of the characteristics of depressive episodes, they actually sound really bizarre. So for example, you can have hypersomnia, which is sleeping too much, or insomnia, which is sleeping too little. You can have weight gain and increased appetite, or weight loss and decreased appetite. You can have people who feel very, very restless and can't sit still, and people who have trouble getting out of bed. And in my mind, when I look at these two entities, I kind of view them as opposites, right? Like, on the one hand, we have one person who's sleeping too much, eating too much, and has a lot of trouble getting out of bed, and they're gaining a bunch of weight. And then on the other side, you have someone who's not sleeping at all, is not really eating at all, and is restless and has trouble falling asleep. How on earth, and I implore you to just think about it logically for a second, how on earth can these two things be the same illness? And the good news is that from a clinical perspective, psychiatrists kind of understand this. We've even figured out that when you really tunnel down into depression, that there are multiple kinds. So for example, even when we ask questions, we've learned to ask, do you sleep too much or do you sleep too little? If you look at screening tools or measurement tools for depression, they actually have different categories. So for example, some depressions tend to be more cognitive in nature, and some depressions tend to be more physical in nature. And what we can see from these perspectives on depression is that essentially in psychiatry, there are three subtypes of depression. One is an anxious depression, which is characterized by a mind that's restless, characterized by insomnia, characterized by a decreased appetite. And then there's also something else called a neurovegetative depression. And neurovegetative depression is characterized by hypersomnia, by eating too much, and low energy levels. So we can see that these two clusters, we kind of know as clinicians that these are different entities. The other really interesting thing is that there's a third type of depression called depression with anger attacks. And these people, when they experience depression, don't necessarily get quite as sad, but they tend to get very, very frustrated and angry. They tend to have a super short fuse and have periods of time where they're just incredibly irritable. And the interesting thing is that medications actually respond differently to each of these subtypes of depression. So a sophisticated psychiatrist will sort of target their medication to each of these subtypes. And we even know that the neurotransmitter profiles that affect each of these subtypes is different. For example, we have some antidepressants that are what we call activating antidepressants, and they give people more energy. They kind of help them kickstart their day. And those activating antidepressants tend to work well for people with neurovegetative depression. And then we also have calming antidepressants. And these antidepressants tend to have strong anti-anxiety effects as well, and they kind of calm the mind. And these tend to work well with people with anxious depression. And then the most fascinating thing is that there are some antidepressants that also work on dopaminergic transmission, which seems to be altered in people with depression with anger attacks. So we'll even have some antidepressant medication that's used for things like restless leg syndrome, which actually works for people with depression with anger attacks. So if you look at sort of Western medicine, what you see is that the way that psychiatry is organized from the top is to think about disease as being independent from a person. But the closer that you get to actual clinical practice, the more that you get closer to the individuality of a patient. Now let's take a look at the Ayurvedic perspective. So in Ayurveda, remember that every person has their own natural dosha. And their natural dosha is their prakriti, which also correlates with their genetics. So that's their genetic level of doshas. So I can have low vata, high pitta, high kapha, or any kind of combination. And then what happens is we get disturbances of our natural doshas based on our environment, our diet, or other kinds of life circumstances. And when we cross a particular threshold, that's when we sort of manifest a disease. So what Ayurveda kind of says is that depression is essentially a kapha imbalance. It's kapha that's gotten too high. But then the question becomes, does kapha that gets too high manifest differently depending on your prakriti? So if I have genetically high levels of vata and my kapha goes through the roof, does that depression manifest differently than if I have genetically high pitta and my kapha goes through the roof? And the answer is absolutely yes. And if you look at the Ayurvedic perspectives on depression, what they basically say is that there are three kinds of depression. There's a vata depression, there's a pitta depression, and there's a kapha depression. The other way to kind of think about this is that when each of these genetic predispositions experience stress, they manifest that stress in a particular way. So vatas, when they are under stress, tend to experience anxiety. When pittas are under stress, they tend to experience anger or irritability. And when kaphas experience a bunch of stress, they tend to manifest depression and sadness. And so I don't know if this is starting to sound kind of familiar, but it's really cool because these Ayurvedic doshas perfectly overlap with the psychiatric subtypes of depression. So essentially what we've got is anxious depression, which is essentially a kapha imbalance in a vata person. And then we have depression with anger attacks, which is a kapha imbalance in a pitta person. And then we have straight neurovegetative depression, which is a kapha imbalance in a kapha person. And so when I'm working with people like this, I think it's been really, really helpful for me as a clinician to understand Ayurveda, because it allows me to know from the get-go what kind of treatment am I trying to target for a particular person. Do they have anxious depression? Do they have depression with anger attacks? Or do they have neurovegetative depression? And while I may tailor some of my medications to each of these three types, the coolest thing is that when I start to implement Ayurvedic perspectives, I kind of handle not just the kapha imbalance, but I bring their vata down if they have anxious depression. And I bring their pitta down if they have depression with anger attacks. And I boost their energy and raise their kapha if they have neurovegetative depression. So what Ayurveda essentially says is that disease cannot be independent of a person. They really think of disease as dependent upon a particular constitution. And so you can take any uniform disease-like process, like a kapha imbalance, and depending on what you layer that kapha imbalance on top of, that will manifest in a unique way. And that's a really powerful way of helping people. Because in the Western system, healthcare isn't really about people. We diagnose people with stuff, and all of our research is about treating that independent disease process. And clinically, what I really like about taking this perspective is it lets me know from the get-go where this person needs to go. And it allows me to tailor my treatment to them. And most importantly, when I think about starting someone on a medication, when I start balancing their underlying doshas, the good news is that once their dosha is in balance, once their kapha kind of gets balanced, once their vata gets balanced or their pitta gets balanced, it helps me scale back on the medication more easily, reduce the level of side effects that they get, and even improve other parts of their life. Because remember that when we talk about doshic imbalance, it doesn't just manifest in one way. right? If I have a vata elevated, as well as having a kapha elevated, I may get depression, but I'm also going to get symptoms of anxiety. I'm also going to get symptoms of ADHD. My mind is going to have a lot of difficulty concentrating on anything when my vata is disturbed. So we have a saying in medicine, which Ayurveda understands really well, which is that all boats rise together. And if we raise the water level, all of our individual problems will get better. And that's really what Ayurveda aims to do, is by balancing your doshas, all of the different things that you suffer from, hopefully will start to get better kind of all at once. Let's talk about Ayurvedic perspectives of depression. Of depression? Does that sound right? Okay. Let's talk a little bit about Ayurvedic. There it is. Waiting for it. Welcome to Healthy Gamer, where we put the rect in erect. No, it's like rect, but the electronic version. Erect.